All right, so we're going to talk about Freud today, one of my favorite subjects to lecture on. And let's talk about who Freud was as a person. He was born in Moravia, which is, I didn't bring a map in with me. You guys should all take my Nazi Germany class and you'll learn to see maps of all these places. But Moravia is it's sort of like a German, mostly German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia. He later on moves to Vienna, and he spends most of his life in the big city of Vienna. Okay. He is a very interesting family history. His mother is half the age of his father. He's in his 40s and she's in his 20s. I think the book has the exact ages, which you guys might think, oh my gosh, that's such a strange LA kind of trophy wife type of couple. But actually that's very common, fairly common back in the day. And especially the father was widowed, and he gets widowed, so he finds another young woman for a wife, and then he has more kids, and that was a relatively common thing. But people make a big deal over Freud's mother being so young. And they say a lot of Freud's theories can be traced back to the fact that he had a young mother who was very pretty, and then he had some sort of attachment to her, and people think, oh, that's where he got this Oedipal complex from, because he had his own sort of attachment to his mother and that sort of thing. So people talk about that. His father was fairly authoritarian. Again, nothing unusual about that, very typical, especially for a German-speaking family. Even a Jewish family, his family was Jewish. Even for a Jewish family, authoritarian child raising was very common in Germany and in Austria-Hungary at the time. Freud was not raised in Germany. He was raised in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was a conglomerate of different kind of nationalities and ethnic groups, all under one rule of the Habsburg monarchs. And they ruled Austria-Hungary, and you guys may or may not know, but that empire lasted, had to do with the start of World War I, that the King Ferdinand was assassinated on a visit to a neighboring country, and that's the domino effect on World War I that started World War I. Needless to say, the Austro-Hungarian Empire did not survive by the end of World War II. It was no longer there, and all the countries that had previously held it together now became separate countries, and there's a whole history of the Nazi invasion of Czechoslovakia and Austria and those kinds of things. Yes?
I was just wondering, I read that they had pushed Freud's education and everything more so than their other siblings. Is that true?
Yes, that's a very good point. Yes, so Freud was at least the eldest of his mother's children. And so, especially the daughters, Freud's sisters, they were, Freud was given sort of a special position. He was a smart kid, and they said, we're going to support him to go to school and get a good education so he can make something of himself, even to the detriment a little bit to the other kids. Okay, but he was also the oldest, so again, not necessarily unusual. And also the fact that he was the male child, the oldest male child, not unusual that he would be given sort of special attention, special resources over the other kids. Okay, that's not necessarily very unusual. That's something you would have found, especially in a family where, Freud's family wasn't rich. His father was, I believe, some kind of a merchant. And so again, they put the resources toward him. He was a very smart kid, very, very precocious, very bright. So the family moves to Vienna when Freud is still very young. He goes through school. He goes to, he has ideas of things he wants to do. However, you got to realize that many professions are essentially closed to Jews. Jews are not allowed to be in certain professions. So you have to realize also that in Austria, and especially in Vienna, Vienna was really the hotbed of anti-Semitism for all of Europe. It was anti-Semitism, ground zero. I mean, it's where most of the anti-Semitic stuff, a lot of it emanated from Vienna. There was a number of famous writers who were writing around the time that Freud was there, especially in his young age and certainly when he was an adult, who were fomenting anti-Semitic thoughts, anti-Semitic views. Hitler lived in Vienna for a while, and of course he was very susceptible to these ideas, and that probably had something to do with him becoming so anti-Semitic. But anti-Semitism didn't start with Hitler. It was going on for a long time in Europe, and especially in Vienna. So Freud was really in the central place where there's a lot of hatred and a lot of prejudice and racism toward Jews. Okay? So there were lots of jobs he couldn't go into. And then there were jobs that Jews would typically do. Okay? One job that typically Jews would do would be to be a barber. And they had nursery rhymes about, like, if you're a bad kid, the barber's going to come in, and he's going to cut your fingers off. Or the tailors were also Jews. And those were typical jobs for Jewish individuals. And then there's a great nursery rhyme called Stroll Peter about this monster that comes in after the bad kids and cuts off their thumbs with his tailor's scissors, right? And it's code for, if you're a bad kid, the evil Jew is going to get you. Okay? So tailors, barbers. The other profession open to Jews was medicine. Okay? So Freud decides to become a medical doctor. So he goes to school to become a medical doctor, and he doesn't really want to go into clinical practice. He's not really that interested in clinical practice. He's interested in neurology. He wants to be a neurologist. He trains as, in addition to his general practice, he trains what we would call nowadays as sort of postdoc. He trains as a neurologist. Okay? And he does a lot of research, some very important research on nerves. He does research on cocaine, both academic and personal research. Cocaine is a new thing at the time, and people are sort of discovering it in Europe. They're able now to synthesize it from the cocoa plant so they can turn it into a substance, a more potent substance. It is all the rage, and Freud becomes quite enthusiastic about it. Yes?
I heard that Freud himself experimented with cocaine.
Yes, Freud did a lot of coke. He was very enthusiastic about it, and he recommended it to his friends and his colleagues. He wrote letters to his wife, passionate letters saying, I'm going to come visit, I'm paraphrasing, I'm going to come and visit you, a man, fueled with cocaine, to love you up, and, that kind of stuff. I mean, he was really into it. Until he found that some of his colleagues and people that he knew developed an addiction to it, and because of that addiction had a lot of problems. Now, as we know nowadays, they didn't have crack cocaine back in the day. This was just cocaine that you would inject or you would snort, and injecting is pretty hardcore. But we know, cocaine is an addicting drug, but it's not as addicting as it's not as addicting like as opiates. And so we know now that a lot of that addiction it's psychological addiction. And again, you can go read, I have a whole chapter in my book about Freud and his cocaine use, and you can go read that in the library. I wrote a whole book on drug abuse. It's in the library, and you can read about Freud. But Freud basically decided he saw people getting addicted to it. He started to see the negative consequences, and he started to pale. His enthusiasm began to pale, and he didn't like it so much, and he just stopped. Didn't have really any withdrawal effects. Just thought, I'm done with this. Didn't have an addiction to it. Was able just to stop fairly quickly. It wasn't a problem for him, which is very interesting because, as we know, Freud was not a guy without an addictive personality because he was highly addicted to nicotine. He smoked somewhere between 10 and 20 cigars a day, big, thick cigars a day. He was not able to stop smoking cigars, even after he was diagnosed with cancer of the jaw from smoking cigars. So we know he had addictive personality. It's just cocaine wasn't the thing that gave him whatever feeling that caused him to want to come back more and more and more and more. okay, which is really kind of interesting. And this is why I started my book with this chapter, because it's kind of interesting. Somebody can have an addictive personality, but they're really only attracted, they only become addicted to a certain drug, and they might not get addicted to another one. Okay, so this is kind of an interesting thing. Yes?
So like, addiction is like selective?
It's not that addiction is selective. I'll make a long story short. It's that the people with certain personality deficits become attracted to certain drugs, and at least, or they become addicted to certain drugs that maybe have something that maybe relate to the feeling the drug gives you, maybe relates to, at least temporarily, sort of fixing that personality deficit. Right? In Freud's case, cocaine was not the drug that fit the key of his personality. Right? It was nicotine. Right? Now, we also know nicotine is a lot more addictive than cocaine, by the way. In case anybody here is an ex-smoker, you ever smoked cigarettes and given up smoking, you know how hard it is, really hard to do. Cocaine, if you don't have a psychological issue underlying it, is, especially you don't have a severe psychological issue, and you're not doing a really potent form like crack or injecting it, not nearly as addictive. Yes?
You found there to be addiction differences within the mode of use, insufflation versus intravenous?
Yeah, I think there's different. I mean, especially with crack, because we see people getting addicted. I mean, not as much now. Now it's amphetamines, but it's a similar idea. If you get more in, then the effect is greater, and so the addiction can be greater. So there is some. I think my belief is there's some modulation by effect. Freud was almost certainly injecting cocaine, but for whatever reason that was not a big issue for him to stop using it. So he's a clinical neurologist. He's doing research, postdoc research. Doesn't really want to go into clinical practice. Wants to become a researcher, which eventually would lead to an academic position and becoming a professor. But he has to abandon that idea. Why do you think he has to abandon becoming a researcher?
Money.
No, because universities don't hire Jews. You don't want to hire Jews. So again, because of anti-Semitism, he goes from being, from wanting to have a career as a researcher and as an academic, he really decides that in order to make a living, enough to have a family and support a family, wants to get married to his wife, he's going to need to go into clinical practice. So that is a way that a Jew, as a physician, can make money. So he goes into clinical practice as a clinical neurologist. He's not a psychiatrist. This is another common misconception. People say Freud was a psychiatrist. Freud was trained as a neurologist. He wasn't a psychiatrist. Now, back in the day, there was a lot less distinction between these medical specialties. And I've even heard recently somebody who told me now that all the psychiatrists that are coming out are cross-trained in psychology, or in psychiatry and neurology. A lot of them are psychiatry and neurology. So even today, the distinction may not be quite as strong as maybe between other specialties, like a cardiologist and a nephrologist, for instance. Kidney specialists and a heart specialist are really different. Psychiatry, neurology, there's some overlap there. Okay? But he becomes a clinical neurologist, and he does this in the late 1800s, 1881. And he works with an interesting guy, Joseph Breuer, and starts to develop what ends up becoming psychoanalysis. And in 1900, he publishes The Interpretation of Dreams. So he starts practicing, almost like 19 years before he really publishes, his first really seminal work. Okay, so it's not like psychoanalysis sprang up in his head overnight. He's working with guys like Breuer. Breuer is seeing cases of so-called hysteria, where clients, especially, they wouldn't have called them clients, they would have called them patients, are coming in with some sort of somatic complaint. Paralysis, numbness of a limb, unexplained by any physical cause. Okay? And Breuer sort of specializes in these patients, and these people come to him, and he starts to develop what becomes known, Freud or somebody called it, the talking cure. Okay? The talking cure, where you talk to the patients. And the idea is if the patients can have what is called an ab reaction. They have all sorts of fancy terminology in psychoanalysis. This is typical of the medical profession. It's how you know it came from doctors, because they have all sorts of language that only they understand and lay people do not understand. They love this stuff. It's still rampant today. If the patient can have an abreaction, which you would call a cathartic experience, you know what I mean by cathartic experience? You had some hidden secret and you're able to actually get it out. It's able to have that out. Then you can have a reaction where the symptom becomes lessened. And so Brewer experimented with this. And he experimented with talk and cure, he experimented with hypnosis, and Freud experimented with hypnosis. Hypnotize somebody, get them to recall a particularly difficult memory, and then they have this cathartic experience, and then their symptoms go away. Okay? Now you got to realize that when this is going on, this is back in Victorian times. Okay? This is the Victorian era, from England, Victorian England. And people, Northern Europeans, are very, very, very uptight about anything having to do with sex. Okay? Very uptight sexually. Sex is seen as something, for women, it's something just basically for procreation. It's not to be enjoyed. For men, the idea is to get it over with as quickly as possible and go back to your normal self. It's very repressed. Okay? And if you take my Psych 473 class next spring, I will talk to you about some of the ways this sexual repression was dealt with. I'm not going to go into it in this class, but it's really interesting. Katie will tell you how hysteria was treated in women, how women were treated for hysteria before Freud and before talking therapy, but not maybe for the sort of conversion reactions, the somatic things. But it's a very interesting history. Take the class, and I guarantee you will be shocked. Is that right, Katie? It's pretty shocking, right? Yeah. Okay. So I'm not going to tell you what it is. You have to take my class to find out. But Freud's seeing a lot of these people who we saw them today, we would say, oh my God, they're so repressed, it's causing psychological issues for them. Okay? And so a lot of Freud's patients were, especially in the beginning with Brewer, were women who had these sort of hysterical conversion somatic symptoms. Okay? And so experimented with hypnosis. There's some other weird things too. There was operations on the nose and weird stuff that you don't need to worry about. I don't think your book talks about that too much. But this talking cure, this idea that people would have this cathartic reaction, and that would be something that would relieve the symptoms. Brewer has a famous case, which is in your book, Anna O. Anna develops feelings for Brewer, and Brewer probably develops feelings back for Anna. This is something we now call, Freud later on called transference, that Anna O transferred the love and the feelings she might have had as a child toward her parents. She transferred that on as an adult toward Brewer. As we know that for children, love is just love. For adults, love also can be tinged with sexuality, especially if you're very repressed. And this made Brewer very uncomfortable, because he was having some feelings in return, which later on Freud coins the term countertransference. And Brewer abandons the case. He's done with it, and basically she's cured and doesn't want to see her anymore, and that's it. And so this is the famous case that Freud writes up. And you realize this is not Freud's case. Freud was not the one treating Anna. Brewer was treating her. But very famous case that he writes up, where his main ideas come from. Okay, the main idea is about repression of the unconscious and the idea of the unconscious. Now, Freud wasn't the first person to talk about the unconscious, but he was certainly the first one to really explicate it and explicate the mechanisms of the unconscious. Okay? We'll talk about that a little bit more in detail in the lecture today. Okay? Freud, I think I mentioned Freud uses hypnosis, but he abandons hypnosis as a technique. And why do you think he would abandon hypnosis?
Because it didn't work on everyone?
Doesn't work on everyone. So, you can test to see how well hypnosis will work on you. There's a simple test. It's called the sclera test. What you can do is keep your eyes open and roll them up in your head. Okay? Yes, really roll them up. Don't move them, just roll them straight up in your head. So when I do it, can you see my eyes when I do it? How much white is showing? How much white is showing? as opposed to the black part of the pupil? Is it just white, or is it
Little pupil.
little pupil but a lot of white, right?
Well, your eyes are mostly closed.
Mostly closed, let's see if I can do it.
There you go. Yeah, now they're mostly white.
Yeah, so I'm relatively easy to hypnotize. The more, supposedly, I took some training in hypnosis many, many years ago, and this is what they told me. Supposedly, the more white you can show when you do that, the more easily you're hypnotized. I'm pretty gullible, so I'm reasonably hypnotized. Try it. Not bad, you're about halfway. Try it. No, you're going to be really hard to hypnotize. Try it. You gotta open your eyes.
Am I doing?
Halfway. Halfway. Try it. No. You're going to be a tough subject. Okay? On and on. You guys can try it on yourself. Look in the mirror and try this. Oh, you can't really. If you do it really well, you can't tell. Right? You got to get somebody to look at you to do it. But not everybody is hypnotizable. Okay? Not everybody's easily hypnotizable. And so Freud decides this is not a good way to go back and to reclaim repressed memories. Okay, this is not good. This is not good to get people to their unconscious stuff, because not everybody's equally able to do this. Now, other people, by the way, later on did not have Freud's view, and there's whole schools of hypnotherapy and hypnosis as psychotherapy that are still around today. And the biggest proponent of that was a guy named Milton Erickson. And there's whole schools and training programs in Ericksonian hypnosis, and you can go and if you become a therapist, you can go train in the Milton Erickson Institute, and you can learn to use hypnosis as therapeutic modalities. A lot of people really like it, even still. So a lot of people don't agree with Freud, and they think hypnosis is great, and they have other methods for inducing people into hypnosis, and even people a little more difficult, they've found ways to work with them and do those kind of things. And you may have heard some controversy because these sort of repressed memory things. They would take a kid or a young adult into a therapy session and hypnotize them, and the person would start remembering all sorts of abuse, and they would start remembering that their parents secretly took them to a satanic cult and all this kind of stuff. Which, at least the satanic cult stuff, has never been objectively proven to be real. And what the thought is that the person's under hypnosis, they're more susceptible to having memories implanted by the therapist. And so there's a little controversy about hypnosis, especially in recovering repressed memories. And I don't think that's ever really been succinctly, conclusively dealt with. Okay, but just so you know, not everybody agreed with Freud. Some people think hypnosis is great and they would practice it. And again, if you're interested, you could go online and look up Milton Erickson and find some information about that. But Freud decides to abandon hypnosis. And what he does instead is to develop a technique that he calls free association. Okay, free association. And free association is, you all know about this because you've all heard the stereotypes about Freudian psychology, Freudian psychoanalysis. This is where the patient lies on the couch, right? And it's a special kind of reclining couch, which you don't see too often anymore. But they used to make them, and you can still buy them. I think IKEA sells something that's really similar, where it's kind of like a reclining couch, like a day bed, where it's kind of got an angle, and you recline on it, and you can just lie on there. And then what would happen would be the analyst would sit behind the patient, and then the patient would be told just to talk about anything that comes to their mind. And a lot of time they would be doing this in a room that was quiet, maybe dimly lit, maybe with some figures, kind of amorphous paintings or figures in the room. And again, I don't know if we have a picture of Freud's office. I should bring them in and show it to you. But he had all sorts of figurines. I think he was an amateur archaeologist. He had sorts of figurines and things in there that people can sort of space out on. And basically you would lie on the couch, and in our modern vernacular, you would just space out and just talk and just space out. And you'd forget the analyst was there because you aren't looking at them in the face, looking at them directly, and you'd forget they're there. You'd just start like spacing out, and then stuff would start bubbling up from the unconscious. And then the analyst's job would be, to sort of start putting the unconscious, put the pieces together. Okay? And they might start making a comment, oh, it's interesting you mentioned your mother, tell me more about that. Mother, well, my mother did this, the person would start rambling on about things. And then what the analyst does is to start to perceive unconscious patterns this person would have. Okay? Unconscious patterns that are key to the information that has been repressed. Okay? The other thing the analyst would do would be to encourage the patient to talk about their dreams. And as Freud said, the dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. Dreams, we have lots of unconscious stuff in our dreams. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit later on about how Freud views dream analysis, how Freudians do dream analysis, which is different than Jungians and other people, the way they look at dreams. And so that's also a way, dream stuff would come up. And the analyst's job is to listen to all this unconscious material, start to see the pattern, and then reflect what that pattern is back to the patient, doing something that Freudians call interpretation, that you would be interpreting the patterns that you're hearing, either from the dream or from the free association. And then you do this over and over and over and over and over again until the patient is actually able to start internalizing the knowledge of this pattern and to realize that they themselves have some insight that they're doing these patterns. And then once they have the insight into it, then they're able to choose to stop doing whatever the destructive pattern is. And also going along with this would be Freud's original idea of having catharsis. But Freud also abandons catharsis as the be all and the end all of this talk therapy. Why do you think Freud abandons catharsis? Anybody here ever had a cathartic experience? Where just maybe you had a secret, and then suddenly it came out, and then you just felt so much better. You were relieved. Anybody ever had something like that happened to you? Most of us had some time in our life some kind of cathartic experience, or it might have been something positive. You went to a rock concert, and and I don't know who it is you listen to nowadays. Taylor Swift or somebody came out and did your favorite song, and you just were able to let out all your emotions. As you got your lighter there, and your whatever emotion Taylor Swift evokes among people of your generation. I cannot speak to that, but you know what I'm talking about, right? You have this kind of emotion, you're able to let your emotions out, let your feelings out. They've been bottled up and you're able to let them out, right? It can be a positive thing, or it can be a negative thing. You have a deep, dark secret, you're abused as a child, you never told anybody, and then you went to the therapist, and the therapist was talking, and suddenly you just let out the secret. You told them about this abuse and just felt this weight lifted off your shoulders, right? That kind of thing, that's a cathartic experience. Why do you think Freud abandoned that as the end point for therapy, putting it in modern terms? Yes?
Because that's just an emotional release, and it's not absolving of the actual problem?
Partially, yes. It doesn't necessarily lead to an insight into the problem, okay? And that actually, your explanation leads up to why Freud didn't leave that as the end point. Because what happens? You have a cathartic experience, and then you keep going to therapy. What's going to happen now? What are you going to do to that experience? What are you going to do to it? You're going to repress it again. And then what do you need to do? You need to have another cathartic experience, right? And so you come to therapy basically to have a cathartic experience. You never get well. You just have a series of cathartic experiences. And this is a big critique that Freudian psychologists, Freudian analysts have about other forms of therapy, especially humanistic therapy, like the kind of therapies we did in the 60s and 70s. You guys ever heard of primal scream therapy? I was actually at a workshop once where people were doing primal scream therapy. You go out on the top of a hilltop, outside somewhere where there's not a lot of people around, you just scream at the top of your lungs. Right? It's very cathartic. You should try it sometime. It's actually kind of fun. Just scream at the top of your lungs. It's very cathartic, right? Get all your emotions out. You've dealt with all these emotions in therapy. You just go and scream them out, right? Well, what would happen to these cathartic people doing this primal scream therapy is that 2 weeks later, they'd have to come back and do more primal screaming because the stuff would build back up again. They hadn't dealt with the underlying problems. And so this catharsis after catharsis, this is great if you're a therapist, because what does it mean? Repeat customers, right? People have to keep coming back to you for more, catharsis, right? So a lot of therapists unconsciously, I don't think they mean to do this. A lot of therapists, like some of these kind of humanistic cathartic therapies because they got a lot of repeat clients, and they'd have clients that come and stay with them for years and years and years and years. I knew people who did this, and I thought, I never saw their clients actually get better. They never gained any insight. They just had cathartic experiences, which was fine. They could function. It would help them to function in life. But they never got insight into, the problem that was causing the need for the catharsis. And so Freud sees this, and Freud then abandons the catharsis as the endpoint of therapy. Okay. Yes?
So was the case study of Anna O, was that just a catharsis?
Yes, so the early cases, like Anna O, you see catharsis. So Anna O was a good example of catharsis, right? She has a cathartic experience. She's able to talk about, she was taking care of her sick father, and she had all this repressed, emotions around that. She was able to let those come to the surface, have this cathartic experience, and then get better, right? But there was a lot of stuff in her case that doesn't get explored, like her attraction, her love for Brewer, right? The transference, right? So in a more modern Freudian, working of that case, the therapist, she would stay in therapy after the catharsis and work. Where's that transference coming from? This replaying out of this childhood, attachment, love for a parent playing out with the therapist, and the real. In a modern sense, the real key to that case would be her understanding transference, how she's taking this pattern that she learned as a 2 or 3 year old and then applying that in her adult life, and where that is maladaptive, by having some insight into that. But now we don't know because she wasn't followed. They later found out somebody did some research and tracked down who she was, and they found out she became a social worker and did all this great stuff. And I think it's very interesting because her therapy, original therapy, was around taking care of her father, and her father eventually dying, and then she grows up to become a social worker, also a rescuer, right? So Freud would have called this a repetition compulsion. Right, she wasn't able to save her father, so she grows up and just keeps trying to save her father in the guise of other people and becomes a social worker. Right? I mean, so a modern Freudian might not think that case really was fully resolved. Right? On the other hand, apparently she was relatively normal, and you don't have to fully resolve things to live a normal life. We all have unresolved stuff, by the way. Just in case you were thinking that you were free of this stuff. From a Freudian point of view, we all have unresolved stuff, okay? And even analysts who go through psychoanalysis and deal with big issues, there's still stuff, there's still blind spots, right? And Freud was one to suggest that analysts, they should be reanalyzed every 5 years. That never happened. They get analyzed once and that's it for them. But originally the idea is that that analysts are going to need to constantly keep being reanalyzed because we all have stuff, unconscious stuff that we haven't dealt with. Now, to be a good psychoanalyst, you have to go through training, and your training includes your own personal analysis because you've got to at least deal with the big stuff to be a good therapist. Okay? This is a big problem, for instance, I have with some of the graduate programs for clinical psychology now, that they don't require their clinical psychology students to go through any sort of therapy, not even psychoanalysis, I mean any sort of therapy, that the clinical psych students aren't required to go through any sort of therapy. And so what happens is they have a lot of unconscious stuff bubbling right below the surface, and it starts interfering with their interaction with their patients and their clients. And again, I've supervised a number of these people, and I've had a number of people in classes, doctoral students and master's students, and this comes up all the time. Why am I having such a hard time with this client? I'm just doing cognitive behavioral therapy. We're just talking about this person's maladaptive thought patterns. We're not doing anything unconscious, but I'm just having such a hard time working with this person. It's making me anxious, and every time they walk in the room, my stomach goes into knots, and I don't know why. Well, the why is because you haven't been in therapy yourself and dealt with your own stuff, right? And so Freud was one of the first to say, for the doctor to be effective, the doctor has to undergo the cure first, right? Unfortunately, my brethren clinical psychologists have forgotten this basic principle. Basic principle. I mean, I would not want to go to see a psychologist who had never themselves been in therapy, And this is where psychology and medicine part ways, right? Because I don't mind to go see a surgeon who never had an appendectomy. My appendix is ruptured, I need to have my appendix out. I can go to a surgeon who has not themselves experienced an appendectomy. They may still have their appendix. That doesn't matter to me. The guy's trained, he knows how to take appendix out, he doesn't have to have the experience of having a bad appendix, right? It might help him be more, compassionate toward me, but it's not necessary because it's a technical thing he's going to do. He's going to go in, he's going to take a little hole, he's going to take my appendix out. It doesn't have to have an appendectomy. It's different in psychology because what you're using, especially as a Freudian psychoanalyst, is you're using your personality as the instrument. If your personality is out of whack because you haven't dealt with your own unconscious stuff, you will not be able to effectively help somebody else, and you might end up hurting the other person. Because your weird stuff is going to come out, and it's going to cause you to become enmeshed with that patient, that client. And this is where you find, therapists, sleeping with their patients and, doing weird business deals with them. All sorts of inappropriate stuff comes up. In the worst cases, you see these kind of things. And the idea that my profession, the clinical psychology profession, is not requiring this of their patients to me is, they want to treat it like an appendectomy, and it's not. And this is the fiction now. Unfortunately, this is my opinion, so you can take this with a grain of salt, but this is the fiction that's out there now. Freud had it right the first time, okay? That you need to deal with your own stuff before you can go out and start helping other people. You need to calibrate your own instrument, so to speak, before you can go out and start applying it to other people, okay? And this is kind of a hallmark of psychoanalysis, okay? All right, it's a little off tangent, but the idea here that Freud starts to get at this stuff in the interpretation of dreams, right? So it just comes out in the beginning of the thing. So it doesn't come overnight, it takes him a little while, and I'm going to have to go a lot faster. So I talked about all this stuff. Now, a couple terms here that you need to know. Resistance. Resistance. Force that prevents the patient from becoming aware of events and keeps them in the unconscious, keeps the awareness in the unconscious. So if I just go to you, I say to you, Aaron, so I'm going to remember your name. I say to you, Aaron, I just want you to tell me all your deepest, darkest, repressed stuff, right? You won't be able to do it. I mean, maybe if you had some therapy, you would.
It's repressed. So.
But it's repressed. It's repressed. You put it down in there, and you are going to resist me pulling it out. Right? So if I say, I do what Freud originally did, I put you on the couch and I start tapping on your head, come out, I want all this stuff to come out, right? The resistance comes up, no. And you will do everything that you can to resist that therapy. What's a common form of resistance in therapy? What do you do for the second visit? What did our person in the back who didn't show up today do?
Wait, what is the client or the therapist?
The client.
You lie.
Wait, what?
You don't show up.
You don't show up. That's the most common resistance. This is the typical one of the new therapist, right? You go to your clients and you try a little too hard, you're a little too eager, you get their resistance up, and they don't show up. This is therapy 101, the mistake all beginning therapists make, right? That you have to develop what was later on called a therapeutic alliance with the patient. You have to engage the part of their ego that knows they need to come to therapy, and you have to make an alliance with that to get them to come in to overcome this resistance, right? Because the unconscious stuff does not want to come out, okay? Because coming out creates a tremendous amount of anxiety. It's repressed in the first place because it creates anxiety. This person's anxious, they got to repress that stuff. I don't want to deal with it, Some thought about my mother, when I was a kid. Put that away. Lock it in the vault, okay? And that's repression, blocking your wish of desire from the unconscious. Resistance is not wanting to see that and keep it from coming back, okay? Does that make sense? We talk about these all the time. They've entered into our daily language. Okay? Resistance, repression. Okay? Now, the emotion that comes from this repression, the anxiety or whatever it might be, the resistance can then maybe be expressed through neurotic symptom. So the problem is these things that are repressed want to come out. They want to come to consciousness. The resistance, the repression keeps them down there, but they want to come out. So what they do is they manifest in some other way. It's like whack-a-mole. You hit it over here and it comes up over here. So, the person represses their feelings. Anna O represses her feelings about her father and the illness, and it comes out in a somatic complaint. That was common in Freud's day. It's much less common now. You don't see these somatic complaints coming up. And I think it's because we're far less sexually repressed. Okay? And by sexually, I mean in the broad sense. We're far less repressed about our pleasure. That we, especially women now, are allowed to feel pleasure in whatever way. The pleasure could be going to a job. The pleasure could be, not having to wear, a corset and a giant hoop dress. The pleasure could be, having an orgasm. It could be any of these things, right? Not just focused, just clearly just on sex. It's a wide variety of things, and so we have less outward repression, right, which is aiding our psychological repression. And so I think the symptoms don't come as strongly as these sort of conversion reactions they had back in the day. Yes?
Could this be considered, the whole somatic complaints of that time, could that be considered like a cultural bound syndrome?
Very good. Very good point. And again, you also are in the class. So yes, you can think of it as and by culture, you can also think of time period, right? In Victorian culture, those kind of symptoms were sort of culture bound in that sense. Yeah. Now we have stuff today too. And some of those ones I talked to you about, Western culture bound syndromes. The big one that we may express our unconscious repression stuff in our culture is overeating. How many people here comfort eat? Oh my God, I'm feeling emotionally anxious. I'm repressing something I don't want to deal with. Man, I'm hungry. Another piece of meatloaf for me, please. Another candy bar. And I don't even think about it. And then I go to the doctor and he tells me, you've become gigantically fat and you need to lose weight because you're going to get diabetes and kill yourself. Right? It's like, I didn't realize that. It was unconscious. So I would say to me that would be rather than my arm being paralyzed, I overeat. Right? You can think of other things, maybe road rage. Maybe job performance. There are other things in our society. Maybe some of these periprandial symptoms where you get stomach aches or you get things that look like low blood sugar, but they're not. And we talked about that in the bizarre behavior class. Lots of stuff. Maybe we think we saw aliens. Maybe we thought we were abducted in a severe case, right? People in Freud's time didn't think they were being abducted by UFOs, right? So things change, symptoms change, they go back and forth. Anybody here watch Mad Men? Show Mad Men? You should watch it. It's interesting. Like the 60s, about these advertising executives. Well, what symptom did they have? They were repressing stuff all over the place. They dropped dead of heart attacks, because they were drinking during the day and all sorts of stuff. A lot of our bad habits can have to do with repression. Okay, a lot of our psychological issues have to do with repression. So a lot of these things really can be anything. So this is what the fun thing about being a therapist is that you kind of go on a treasure hunt. You don't really know when the person comes into your office, and so you get to find out and see this stuff unfold, and that's actually really kind of interesting, right? Relationships are another area where our repressed stuff comes back and interferes, right? People who a good example would be guys who avoid intimacy. They never can commit to one girl. They get close enough to her, things start getting really good, their things are going really well, they run away. Right? None of you women have ever had a boyfriend or known guys like that, I'm sure. Right? Ha ha ha. Because it's very common. Right? That could be a thing. Right? So any of these things that can come back, the return of the repressed, can, in some other form, kind of this whack-a-mole thing. Right? And this is what Freud was talking about. And if you think about this, this is really brilliant that Freud came up with this stuff. And these symptoms come back as some kind of neuroses. And I will distinguish to you between neurotic symptoms and deeper symptoms. And back in the day, there was neurosis and there was psychosis. Right? Psychosis, the mind is completely disorganized. Right? And Freudians had a theory about this, which we kind of debunk now because we really think psychosis is really the brain is malfunctioning. Right? But neurosis is the brain working correctly to do what's normal. It's normal to repress some stuff. The brain has to filter out information. If all the repressed stuff came back, if you were unable to repress things and filter information, you would be overwhelmed. The world would overwhelm you. And some people think this is what happens with autistic people. That that they're something's going on in the brain where their filtering mechanism doesn't filter out enough stuff, and they become very overwhelmed with sensations and feelings and all these kind of things. Some repression is normal, right? Some is normal. We all feel anxiety over things. We have some normal repression, right? So we want to have a normal amount of it. Okay, and neuroses is just a little bit more than normal. Something's going on that's a little bit beyond normality. A psychosis is where the repression can't take place because the mind is just disorganized. And then later on, in Freudians, what they do is they have a third area in between the two. And this is the area of personality disorders. Okay, they really have 4 areas, but we're going to simplify. Okay, they have an area of personality disorders. And this is where there are problems in the development of the personality that cause symptoms. And this is more severe than the neurotic stuff that Freud originally talks about. So in Freud's lifetime, he didn't really work. He did a little bit. Freudians didn't work doing psychoanalysis with people with personality disorders. Okay? That's something that comes later. Since this is a class in personality, we're going to talk about that. It's a very important class of disorders. This classical psychoanalytic stuff doesn't work so well with people with personality disorders. It doesn't work with people with psychoses. Doesn't work so well with people with personality disorders, though now modern Freudians are able to adapt psychoanalytic technique to work with people with personality disorders. Okay? But that's a relatively new thing. It was not in Freud's time. Yes?
Could you please define psychosis one more time?
So psychosis, we think of psychosis as the mind is just completely disorganized, right? And we'll talk, in your book talks in your chapter about psychic structures, the ego, the id, the superego, right? So and we'll talk later on in object relations about internalized objects that become integrated, and these make up, these are where these sort of structures come from, and they allow you to negotiate the world in a sort of realistic way. If somebody with psychosis is not able to do this, they don't really, the ego is kind of, disintegrated, it's not really coherent, and so these people have a hard time negotiating, at least from the old Freudian view, they have a hard time negotiating reality, right? What's real and what isn't real isn't quite apparent to them.
So what again was the key difference between psychosis and neurosis? Because both of them, you say that...
So one thing is, the simple thing to think about is psychosis is that the psychic structures are not coherent, they're not organized. And in neurosis, the psychic structures are well established. You have a good superego, you have an ego, you have the unconscious is still there. Another way you can think about it is in psychosis, the unconscious just overwhelms the other structures, and so like everything is sort of unconscious.
I see.
Okay? That's the way sort of the old Freudians would think about it. Okay? And in personality disorders, it's kind of in between. There are some psychic structures, but the integration of these structures, the development of them, there's been something that's gone amiss. Okay? Usually because there's some kind of childhood abuse of some kind. Okay? We'll talk about that in detail. Personality disorder is much more difficult to treat. Okay? Freud's time, they felt really can't treat these. Okay? That's changed now. We'll get to that a little bit later. So just for now, we'll just think about neuroses. Okay, talk about free association. And we could do if we had time, I don't know if we have time today, we could do I've done this before in classes, this sometimes freaks people out. We could actually do a mock free association. I could bring somebody up, and I've done this, bring somebody in the class, turn off all the lights, have them face away from everybody, and just say whatever comes to their mind, and just sit there and go, tell me more about that, right? And then eventually, I've done this before in class, so the person forgot they were in class and just started talking about stuff, like stuff started coming out, bubbling out, right? And this is what free association is. So if you go to a psychoanalytic therapist or a psychoanalyst, this is what you'll do, right? This is the typical treatment. I went to see, a psychoanalyst for 2.5 years. I would go to her office, I would lie on the couch, and I would just free associate. I think I looked at her in the face, maybe 4 times in the 2.5 years that I was seeing her, right? I mean, she would sit behind me and she'd make comments and, interpret. Sometimes she would make an interpretation and a light would go off on my head. Sometimes I'd be like, and then later on I'd realize something and I would talk to her about whatever came to my mind. If I had a dream, I would tell her my dreams, whatever was going on, right? Some people find this very anxiety, because the unconscious stuff starts to bubble out. Some people find this very anxiety provoking. And so they got to sort of ease into it a little bit, right? That was my experience. At first it was really, what's going to come out? After a while you ease into it, it's like, this is just great. I loved it. I love being on the couch. I love not having to look at her. I love to sit there and space out. It was awesome. I really, really enjoyed it. Your mileage may vary, right? And then she would say something to me, it would be shocking. It would be like, somebody dumped cold water on me, like, like have some realization about how crazy I was about something, But it was a really interesting experience. Very different than being in other forms of therapy. Anybody here done other forms of therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy or family therapy or something like that? It's very different. A very different thing, and the goal is very different. Most other therapies, the goal is symptom reduction. You know, you're feeling depressed, you go to a cognitive behavioral therapist, they have you do some homework to, sort of correct your bad thought patterns, and then you start having better thought patterns and you feel a little bit better and you're done, right? Psychoanalysis is not like that. And a lot of times, you'll start feeling worse before you start feeling better, because all the stuff will come out and you'll feel overwhelmed by it. And then, with the help of the therapist and with the relationship you develop with the therapist, the transference you develop with the therapist, that is what sort of affects, you being able to cope with this stuff. Eventually you're able to internalize the therapist. They become part of that thing that, helps you to negotiate this world of what gets repressed and what gets let out, right? So this takes time. And one of the reasons why you don't see tons of people doing psychoanalysis is because it takes time. Typical psychoanalytic treatment, you would go 5 days a week for an hour with a therapist, and you may go, for just a regular neurotic person, you might go for 2 or 3 years. If you got a personality disorder, you may be going for 10 years. So it becomes very expensive, very time-consuming. Again, the techniques have been modified, and you can go do psychoanalytic therapy, where maybe you just go do this and you do it once a week, right? And that's also can work very well. But it's typically a long-term therapy. There have been people who've developed short-term psychodynamic therapies, and you can sit face-to-face. The people have modified some of this stuff somewhat, but the original stuff takes a long time. It's expensive. And so that's why we don't see it. Insurance doesn't want to pay for it. They'd rather just pay for giving you a pill, right? That's cheaper for them. Yes. Freudian view is dreams have two parts: a manifest content and latent content. The manifest part is what you remember in the dream. When you wake up and you have your dream, you wrote down your dream. I woke up, I had a big dream last night. It's a really weird dream. So I wrote this down. For Freudian, that dream has been disguised or distorted. The manifest content is the disguise or distortion of the wish that's originally in the dream. So what you remember is the stuff. You remember you are accessing the unconscious, but you're accessing, it's coming to your conscious mind in a way that's acceptable to the conscious mind. Okay, and it's covering up the actual wish of the dream. So in psychoanalysis, you lie on the couch, you talk about your dream with the analyst, and eventually you work from the manifest content of the dream back to the actual original meaning, the latent content, the repressed stuff. Okay? So if you remember stabbing somebody, that's okay for your conscious mind. But what's really going on, something underlying what that actually really means, there's a wish there. Maybe the wish is, maybe you're stabbing a robber in the dream, right? But, you go and you do analysis and you realize what you really want to do is kill your father, That's an Oedipal complex. It's very common. You really want to kill your father, or, as an adult, your father figure, I really want to kill my boss. He's driving me crazy, he's making me nuts, right? Feel really competitive with him. He's too mean to me. He's not giving me enough chances, right? He's out to get me, right? So I really want to. So the wish is that you want to kill your boss. Manifest in the dream is you stabbing somebody else, right? That would be an example, okay? And in anything like that. So you have these two kinds of things about dreams. And I think I put something up on the slides that this manifest in this latent part. This is not from your book, but I'll give you this. And the disguise of the dream distorting the dream take on four typical ways. Condensation, where you move symbols, together. So, for instance, the dream of stabbing somebody, maybe that symbol is a knife that's killing somebody, but maybe also it's a penis. Maybe that represents having sex. Maybe it's both of them, right? That's condensation. Okay. Freudians, by the way, like to talk a lot about sex, because the most stuff that we're repressing is sexual stuff, right? It's sexual stuff from childhood. Freud got in a lot of trouble for talking about childhood sexuality. But for Freud, childhood sexuality is not adult sexuality. In other words, adult sexuality is genital sexuality. Childhood sexuality is pleasure. Where in the body the pleasure comes from. The first stage, the oral stage. The baby sucks and gets its food, and so it gets pleasure in the mouth. Second stage is elimination, retention and elimination. That's the anal stage, right? Third stage, the genital stage. that's where the Oedipal complex starts coming in. And then we have latency, where everything goes on hold for a while, so the kid can learn how to function in culture, learn how to read and do math, and all those kind of things that are necessary, make bow and arrows, whatever the culture requires. And then they get into adolescence, and everything comes back again. All the sexual stuff comes back, right? And you guys will take developmental psychology. You guys are taking developmental. You'll learn all about this. You go into details, and you'll learn. We'll talk later on about how Erickson sort of modifies these. But these are the kind of things that get repressed. Right? So sexual stuff gets repressed. Now, when you were a kid, you had oral pleasure from sucking on the breast and getting your lunch, right? But when you you have some issue with that stage, something happens, your mom throws you against the wall, whatever it might happen. Then you become an adult. That pleasure now might be more centered, may become sexualized in the genitals, right? So as adults, we put adult sexual overlay on childhood sexual experiences. So as an adult, you have an oral issue, then maybe you have a problem with oral sex or whatever. It comes out in some other way. You can't deal with it, But as a child, the sexuality it's about pleasure. Okay, so Freud's terminology unfortunately got him into a lot of trouble for this because they thought he was being kind of perverted and talking about children's sexuality. Really, he's talking about where children are feeling pleasure and where they're feeling anxiety. Okay, pleasure and anxiety. So condensation, two more latent aspects combined into one. Displacement, emotion or desire for latent aspect dream displaced on an unrelating or meaningless manifest aspect. So let's say I want to kill my boss. That's my latent thing in the dream. I want to kill my boss. But what I dream of, holding a flower and, running through a field with a flower, right? Well, I've displaced that feeling onto something that's unrelated. It's safe. Because my conscious mind can accept running through a field with flower. It can't accept. It gets very anxious if I actually realize, if the idea that I want to kill my boss makes me very anxious. Okay? So it gets displaced into something. And this goes along with symbolism. Symbols for Freudians are usually sexual. And the typical one of this that you've probably heard before is the lock and the key. You have a dream where you want to have sex with somebody. You want to have sex with somebody. And, that manifests in the dream as, a lock going into a key, right? And, that's the typical, these kind of things, okay? I think it's more acceptable than conscious. And then secondary revision. This is where we wake up in the morning and we have this kind of jumbly dream, all these images, and we kind of put a narrative to it. We make it logical, right? This is the secondary revision. This can cover up contradictions and absurdities, but those contradictions and absurdities can sometimes hold the key to the dream. And in free association, those will sometimes come back. You'll talk about the dream and go, wait a minute, it wasn't that. It was just something really weird. It didn't make any sense. And then you'll start talking about the thing that didn't make sense. And then that will open up the dream. Okay? Now, Freud believed that dreams represent unfulfilled wishes. Okay? The latent part of the dream always has an unfulfilled wish. There's always something that the dreamer wants to happen. Okay? And this is why you work back. You want to find out what this wish was. Okay? Okay, and then that way you unravel the dream and become a little more aware of your unconscious. Okay, so we talked about, so this is a thing, if you want to do it yourself at home, do this at your own risk. You can try free associating for yourself. You can use a tape recorder, assume a relaxed position, try to speak into the recorder, whatever thoughts come to mind. Try it for half an hour or more, and you'll get a sense, and then you can read back your tape recorder and see if some unconscious stuff came out. I read this on the slide, and I thought, man, I should make an app for that. Just set up my iPad, the analyst app comes on, it starts asking you about this kind of comments, you key it to hear certain things when you're talking, key in on those things and ask you more about that. I thought a free association app, I might get rich off this. I don't know, this is possible. Thinking about this. I have another app idea that I'm going to get rich off of. I'm not going to tell you guys what that is, so you steal it. Okay? But you can try this at home if you want. Okay? Try it at home. You're at your own risk. But I disclaim any, if anything goes up, I will refer you to the counseling center. Okay, we talked about the importance of sexuality, and again, this is pleasure seeking. Libido is the idea. This is the energy, psychic energy. Derived from the biological drive, basically to procreate, right? The id or the ego or the libido. This is the sexual urges, also called eros by Freud, right? Again, it's not necessarily sexual urges, it's the idea to procreate. And you see this in all life forms, right? if there's a beetle out there, that beetle knows how to make another beetle. And we assume that when that beetle makes another beetle, it might even be pleasant, it might experience pleasant experience. We as human beings, as complex animals, we experience pleasure in procreation. Why do you think this is?
Do we want the population to keep going?
Yeah, but why would the population keep going? Well, you know, I kind of don't really care the population goes one way or the other, but it might like to have sex, right? So what do you guys know from Behaviorism 101? If something is reinforced, and what's a reinforcer? A good feeling? Something reinforced, what are you more likely to do? Keep doing it, right? So evolution is very smart, right? And Freud, by the way, like Darwin, evolution is very smart, right? If sex feels good, for those people who were sex felt good, what did they do? They did more of it. And so we evolved to have sex feel good, because that is something our ancestors that, you know, where sex felt good are the ones who passed their genes on. When, you know, our primate or whatever, our amoeba or, you know, bacterial, I don't know, first single cell sexually reproducing ancestors, when it didn't feel good to have sex, they stopped doing it, right? And so they didn't pass their genes on. We are the product of ancestors who, when they had sex, it felt good, right? So when we have sex, it generally feels good. At least it's supposed to, okay, if everything is going correctly. So we tend to do it a lot, right? And that's why we're here. Okay, well, Freud realized this. Okay? So this, you know, there's a genetic thing, and you see this in animals, right? You assume it feels good. I don't know about praying mantises, you know, because, you know, the female will try to eat the head off of it. Maybe it feels good and it's worthwhile. I don't know, you know, but, you know, we see this in the animal kingdom, right? All these animals reproducing, we assume that it must feel good in some way. They feel driven to do this. And as these animals have a sex drive, we also have a drive toward sexuality, toward pleasure, toward sexual pleasure. Okay? Yes?
It was seen in like bonobos that they are almost identical to humans and that they just have sex for fun.
Bonobos have sex to resolve conflicts,
Huh.
okay, which is different than chimpanzees. Chimpanzees resort to a lot of violence to resolve conflicts. Chimpanzees are very violent, by the way. We should talk a little bit about primates at some point in this class.
It was on your reading list, wasn't it? Something about
Yeah,
bonobos?
I think, yeah, the bonobo thing. Bonobos actually use sex to resolve conflicts. So they've actually, which human beings do a little bit of both. We're a little probably more like chimpanzees. We tend to be very violent. We do a little bit of the sexual stuff to resolve conflicts, not nearly as much as the chimpanzees or the bonobos. Yeah. Also, when they follow bonobos in the wild, they also found that they also will kill each other. They have a little more chimp-like behavior out in the wild. But when they're in captive places where humans can see them, they tend to do the sexual. They tend to be a little more sexual. Yeah, they're very interesting. Yeah, if we had a lot of time, we can talk about that. Really interesting in this stuff. Again, take Dr. Campbell's animal behavior class. He will go into detail about this stuff. So, libido, emotional cycle energy derived from the biological drive to procreate, or sexuality, feels good. Drive is a psychological and mental representation of an inner bodily source of excitement. Okay, so we call impulse. Eros is the drive, the sex drive toward life. And then Freud later in his career comes up with this idea of thanatos. And this is a very complicated theory, I think overly complicated, with the idea that we have this drive toward death. Now, we do know biologically that our cells do have this. We have telomeres, and at each reproduction of the cell, the telomeres get smaller, and eventually then the cell is programmed to die. So we do know that biologically this makes sense, but really where thanatos manifests in Freudian theory and how it's useful clinically is it really can think of it as aggressive drive. Because aggression is also very, very important. Okay? Because if you're not if you can't manifest aggression, you need sex, you need pleasure in order to reproduce, but you need aggression to stay alive, right? What are the two things you need to do to stay alive? The grizzly bear is coming to attack you. What do you need to do?
Fight or flight.
Fight or flight, right? Let's say you can't flight, right? You gotta stay and fight. You gotta be aggressive, right? You guys read about that case recently about up in Oregon, the guy riding the bicycle, and the mountain lion came, and the one friend rode off, and the one guy tried to use his bicycle to fight the mountain lion, and apparently the mountain lion got him and ate him and dragged him back to the cave and chomped on his body. That guy needed more Thanatos, right? He needed a machete or something with him. He needed not a bicycle to fight the mountain lion. He needed, a gun or a machete. He needed Thanatos, claws or teeth or something, right? Human beings don't have claws and teeth. What do we have?
Tools.
Big brains and hands, which make us the ultimate tool-making creature. So we have to make our weapons, right? That guy didn't have enough Thanatos, right? He's not passing his genes on. We're all the result of animals that had some ability, some aggressive ability to protect themselves, okay? Because that's why we're here. That guy didn't get enough, unfortunately. Also, he probably was not expecting a mountain lion, right? But you need aggression to protect yourself, right? Somebody's going to come and eat you. If the animal's going to eat you, you need to be able to protect yourself, okay? The other thing is what you need Thanatos for. It's eaten or you're hungry, right? You guys don't realize this because we're modern, and you get hungry, you just go to Vaughn's and buy a steak in the freezer section, right? But it wasn't too long ago. You wanted a juicy steak, you had to go out and track it down, hunt it, and kill it, right? You had to do that yourself. That's not so easy because the other animals don't want to get eaten, and they've got Thanatos to keep them from protect themselves. You had to overcome that. It would be like that mountain lion eating the biker, right? You had to get your lunch. Right, that takes also a measure of aggression. Okay, so again, that's something that is, drive that we have. Okay, now of course we don't necessarily need it to eat anymore, but we use it in, it becomes elaborated with the human imagination in the different forms. Okay, so we have both these things, Eros and Thanatos. Freud comes to Thanatos much later in his career, and some people think it was a reaction to Jung. That Jung had said, yeah, there's all these other drives out there, all these millions of things out there, and Freud said, well, I'll give you one more, right? So he wrote about Thanatos. But these are, if you think about these from an evolutionary standpoint, they make perfect sense. So Freud is very much in line here with Darwinian evolution. It makes perfect sense of these things, right? That we would have these things. You didn't have Thanatos, your ancestors all got eaten up, and you didn't get any genes from those creatures, okay? You got genes from the creatures that protected themselves and knew how to go out and get lunch, right? And also enjoyed reproducing, right? That's why we're here, okay? Okay, I talked to you about the psychosexual stages of development. Oral stage, anal stage, phallic stage is the most interesting from a therapy point of view because this is where you have the so-called Oedipal complex, where you have this sort of castration anxiety and then some resolution of that, and also the electric complex. But my understanding is I think Freud did not call it the electric complex. I think somebody else came on later on and talked about that. But this resolves for women or for girls in something called penis envy, where the young girl realizes she didn't get a penis, and the mom mom didn't have one either, and so mom must have taken it away from her, and the only way she can get it is by getting the love of her father, and the father will then restore that to her, and so she falls in love with the father. It's a little bit different than the Oedipal complex, where the little boy has feelings for the mother, but then is afraid that the father is going to castrate him, and he will lose his penis and he will be killed. And so he has a lot of anxiety over this, but then resolves this by learning to identify with the father so that he can end up having a woman like mom. Okay? And so these two are slightly different. Slightly different. Now, when I first came across these things, I thought, come on, really? Oedipal complex, penis envy, you never see this stuff. Right? And then I started doing therapy. And then you just saw it everywhere. Every person who walked into my office, Oedipal complex, electric complex, just without fail. Penis envy all over the place. Something else we'll talk about later. I think I have a slide on it, womb envy. So there's also a male version. It's not just women, I gotta be fair here, right? This Freudian things Freud got criticized for being misogynist. Women have this penis envy thing. Now men have womb envy too. And that's something you also see. And womb envy results in men mistreating women. All this Me Too stuff, a lot of this is because of womb envy. Harvey Weinstein, great case of womb envy, right? We'll talk a little bit about that. But you see this in therapy all the time. And once you become sensitized to it, you just see it everywhere. Anytime you have some sort of competition with somebody, envy with somebody, you see these things these patterns underlying. Very, very typical in therapy. And so a lot of Freudians, they spend a lot of their time dealing with the leftover residual things from these sort of Oedipal complex, phallic stage issues the person didn't fully resolve. Okay? Very, very, very common. And then latency, 7 years old till puberty, the kid, all this stuff just kind of goes unconscious. The kid spends his time, learning how to get through society. In our society, typically this is when kids start going to school on their own, learning the tools they need to survive in society. And then when they hit adolescence, puberty, all the stuff comes back, all the issues come back. And if stuff didn't get resolved before, now it's going to make an issue. And of course, the storm and drang of adolescence, these kind of things, you see a lot of this stuff. And you guys are going to learn about this in other classes too. So I'm not going to go in a lot of detail about these stages, but if you become fixated in any one of these stages, then later in life, your problems may hark back to these things. So when you talk to your analyst and you free associate, they start noticing things that might tell them where you might be fixated at, which stage you might be fixated at. And that will give, and you can kind of be fixated in more than one, by the way. And if you took that little test that I had the link to up there, you can see which one supposedly you're fixated at. I don't know. But you can do the test for fun, right? Okay, here's another way to look at these psychosexual stages. And again, here are the kind of things this is where the things are, the kind of things you see in each of these stages where somebody may end up having some issue later on in life, okay? And the end of these, negotiation of these stages is the development of the ego and the superego. These structures. Again, you see these things, and this is the adult fixation example of these things. You have problem oral stage. When you grow up, you may smoke or overeat. Anal stage, orderliness, messiness, and OCD stuff can be here. Phallic, you can, sexual deviant stuff. You can start being, a little bit into weird, kinky fetishes. By the way, in my opinion, I actually think this stuff, the weird sexual deviancy stuff, I think actually comes from earlier on. I'm pretty convinced of that. But it can manifest as these kind of things. Latency, you don't really have anything. And if everything gets successfully done, then the person becomes a sexually mature and mentally healthy person. That's the idea. Just a normal amount of neurosis. Because for Freudians, everybody is neurotic to some degree. Okay, in the myth of Oedipus, I don't have time to talk about this. I'll let you guys read the story. It's very interesting. Basically, the story is that Oedipus is abandoned as a child. He's picked up by adoptive parents who bring him up. He doesn't know that he's adopted. Later on, he hears the oracle says you're going to kill your parents. He thinks his adopted parents are his real parents. He loves them very much. He doesn't want to kill them, so he runs away. While he's running away, he gets involved in what I would call a road rage incident and gets in a fight with somebody who kind of cuts him off and ends up killing that person. That person, unbeknownst to him, turns out to be his real biological father. He's going to Thebes, the big city. On the way, he encounters this being, the Sphinx, that has the head and chest of a woman and wings of an eagle and the body of a lion. And the Sphinx sits at the road and asks you riddles. And if you get the riddle wrong, the Sphinx eats you, devours you. And if you get it right, you get to go on your way, right? So the Sphinx asks Oedipus the famous riddle. What first moves on, what first crawls and then, I'll just read the whole thing. I have it here. Here's the Sphinx, here's the pictures of the Sphinx. Paintings. I like this one because she's really big and can devour him. What creature walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 in the evening? Oedipus, this is a fairly easy riddle. Oedipus gets this one pretty quick. It's man because, as a baby he crawls, and then as an adult he walks on 2 feet, and then when he gets old he uses a walking stick and has 3 feet, right? So Oedipus does the riddle. Now, the other counts there's a second riddle, by the way. This one's a little harder. Two sisters, one gives birth to the other, and she in turn gives birth to the first. Who are these 2 sisters? And the answer is day and night. But that one I don't know if I would have gotten. First one I think I would have figured out. Okay. Now the Sphinx either throws herself from a high rock or devours herself because of this, because nobody's ever answered these easy riddles before. It's kind of hard to believe. Anyway, the Sphinx is dead. People from Thebes find out, and they say, Oedipus, you're the great guy who got rid of the Sphinx, so we're going to make you the king, and you can marry the widowed queen. And so he marries the widowed queen, who, unbeknownst to him, her name is Jocasta, and she is his real mother. And life goes on. They do pretty well. They have 4 children, who are both his brothers and sisters and his children. All right, so that's very interesting. But then a plague comes on Thebes, and somebody goes to this oracle, and they say, well, it's because the previous king, Laius, was never avenged for his murder, for his killer. And this starts the ball rolling, and eventually other things start to unravel, and the truth comes out, and people realize that Oedipus realizes that he has married his mother, and he then, Jocasta also knows this, and she goes and hangs herself. And when Oedipus comes in and he sees Jocasta, his wife/mother, hanging, he takes a brooch from her gown, takes the pin, pokes his eyes out, and blinds himself. And then he's taken by his daughter Antigone to go live in another kingdom in exile. Okay? And then she spends her life sort of watching over him and taking care of him. This very interesting part of the myth that's often ignored. This is very interesting because Freud also had a daughter who, when he becomes infirm, takes care of him, right? Kind of relives out this myth of Oedipus, where he's Oedipus and his daughter is the one who takes care of him. He's very close to his daughter Anna. Very interesting. And this is a rendition of him poking his eyes out. Well, that's the story of Oedipus. So Freud basically decides that this is a cool myth and decides to base this phenomenon that he sees in these, that he comes up with this complex. He names it after Oedipus. And this is this Oedipus complex. Boys begin to have unconscious sexual desires for their mother. They want to get rid of the father who's seen as a rival. They fear their father knows about their plan, and they develop castration anxiety. He's going to get me. He's going to castrate me and kill me. Right? Eventually, they repress these feelings and learn to identify with the father. They can't beat him, join him, right? And then they go on to find a woman who can satisfy their needs later in life. In many cases, that woman will be somewhat reminiscent of their mother in some unconscious way. Okay? This is kind of the simplified version of the Oedipal complex. Okay? Now, any of you guys have kids? You don't have kids? Well, when you have a kid, I don't believe this is Freudian crap. It's really bad. I remember when my kid was probably about 5 years old. My wife came home from work. I gave her a hug. I was giving her a kiss. My little boy ran right up in between us and went like this. Pushed me away, and then, Mommy, mine. And you go, oh my God. This is so real, right? So as a father, it was my job to where's my scissors, give that kid some anxiety, right? No, your job as a father is to accept this and realize that this is what little boys do, and this is how they think unconsciously, and that you don't want to create too much anxiety in it because this will cause it that won't get resolved, right? And then you can, eventually they will start to identify with you, right? So this is the kind of thing you see this, right? Very common. You ask people who have little boys, and they'll tell you these stories. It's very common. Okay? And by the way, if I ask my kid about that, do you remember that? When you did that, do you think he'd remember it? That gets repressed. That's normal. And it's a normal thing to repress, right? Because now he's hopefully, hopefully resolve that. Okay? Now, electric complex is a little bit different. Women are a little bit more complicated. Girls also in love with their mothers, okay? Because mothers are the primary caretaker for, at least for, lots of humans. Girls also in love with their mothers, but they notice their own lack of a penis and desire one. They know mom doesn't have one either. They know the impossibility of obtaining a penis, so they desire a substitute. Substitute comes in the form of a baby, right? And so they want to get impregnated. Well, how do babies get made in their family? They get made by the father. So they want to get impregnated by the father, but the father is already taken by the mother. The little girl does not fear castration because she's already missing a penis. And so the supposedly electric complex is a little less intense anxiety-wise for the girls than for the boys. And because of this, according to Freudians, women are less rigidly heterosexual. That's easier for women to have homosexual feelings than for men, the Freudian idea. Now, I'd say take this a little bit with a grain of salt, but this is the Freudian idea. Okay? And then the same thing happens. The women realize this if they want to get, impregnated, they want to have the baby, they got to find a guy like dad, and so they then learn to identify with their mother. Right? So the resolution is very similar. Yes, Katie.
What happens to children that are raised in a single parent family?
Yes, so this is the thing that Freudians, used to worry about. And, what we found is, at least, I can tell you, and I don't know what your book says about this, but what I can tell you is that what happens is that for young men, they would find father substitutes. Okay? Any guys here raised by single parents? Single parent family? I was raised in a single parent family. Okay? My dad's a psychoanalyst. My parents divorced. I was raised by my mom. My dad's a psychoanalyst. I think secretly always thought I was going to be gay because I was being raised by my mom and he wasn't around. Okay? And I think he was really surprised when he realized I wasn't gay, when I brought home my girlfriend to meet him. I think he was like, oh, well, that's not supposed to happen. Kids are really resilient. And I can speak, at least for my own life, what happened for me is that I had many father figures in my life. Teachers, older male friends, mentors of some kind who fulfilled that father role for me. Does that mean I have Oedipal complex issues? Probably. Probably just unresolved stuff. That's very true. That can be true for people in fully, families where they're male and female too. But kids actually can be pretty resilient, right? And so you find father figures who fulfill that role in your life, and that was my case. Okay, that was my case. And the same thing would be for women. If a woman grew up without a mother, she would find other women who would play that role in her life. But yeah, the old school Freudians thought that was a problem. And I thought that was, for men at least, that was a sure way that you could, that's why men became homosexual. We know that's not true. Okay? It didn't seem to pan out. And again, a lot of the old school Freudian stuff, we've modified this. We modify it, knowing what we know now about people. And one thing that we do know is that kids can be very resilient. Okay? And this is one of the areas where I would say is where kids are very resilient. We also know more about at least some types of homosexuality, maybe due to brain hormones and stuff in utero. We have a lot more better science about that kind of stuff. Not to say that all people who are gay, had brain hormone things, but at least we know some of that may be related. There may be some relationship to that. So again, things proceed apace. It's just like, again, if we were talking about physics, I would say, well, Newton, Isaac Newton got some stuff right. It was pretty interesting, and some stuff that was built on and elaborated on. There was some things maybe you didn't quite get, didn't quite understand, right? It's the same thing in Freudian psychology. So the old school Freudians, this is the way they take this as sort of, the way that they would really believe. More modern Freudians, I think, have a more subtle and a more, in my opinion, more correct view of the stuff. They've built on stuff since Freud was around. And that would be one of the things, right? Single family parents. Now, that's not to say you don't find single family parents where, you find, for instance, a boy who has, severe unresolved Oedipal issues. And then he spends his adult life trying to resolve Oedipal issues. For instance, you see this in therapy. If you're a therapist, a guy who goes to work, and no matter what job he has, he always is having issues with his boss. He's always getting into a conflict with his boss, always feeling competitive with his boss. I've seen people like this. There's always an issue. It doesn't matter what they switch jobs, they go to another job, completely different person as their boss, and they have issues. And they keep having issues. And then they get a job where the woman is the boss, they start having issues with their coworkers, competitive stuff with their coworkers. That guy's got an unresolved Oedipal thing, right? That may have had something to do with his family background. Maybe he wasn't able to find, other males to substitute his father figures. Maybe there's some issue there. Or maybe he had an intact family and there was some interaction with his father that went awry some way. So it's very complicated. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. But just having a single parent family doesn't necessarily predict that somebody's going to have an Oedipal issue, especially the old Freudians would say it's going to make the guy gay. Right?
Okay.
So that would be my answer to that. I don't know what your book had something about that too. I don't know if they said something about that. But that would be my answer. We're going to talk about Karen Horney later. She's the one who coined this idea of womb envy. And in short, what womb envy is where men, at some point, a little boy realizes that he cannot procreate. He doesn't have the creative capacity of the mother. He cannot have a baby, right? And what this happens is that they don't have this power that women have, this superpower that women have, to be able to produce another life. And so this makes them upset. And then this is also makes them, they become afraid of this superpower, because they don't have it. So what they end up doing is they devalue women. They grow up to devalue women, put women in a place, they become misogynistic. They feel that women should function to serve them. And then you have this whole Me Too thing that's going on. You have people like Harvey Weinstein and this kind of thing. This is for a feminist psychoanalyst, this would be a result of severe womb envy. That Harvey Weinstein really realized that he couldn't do these things that women can do, and so he really felt the need to repress them and make them into objects, et cetera, control them. Okay? And the idea that he's a filmmaker, it's kind of interesting that he goes into this profession where he is creating things, creating films, creating movies, creating lives, in film, but he can't do it as a man. And so to me, it fits very well with womb envy. I think he's a good example of womb envy. And you see this in men, and you especially see it in men who come in and have this sort of, if they come into your therapy office, they have a sort of dim view of women. They're putting women down, they're devaluing women. And start talking to them, and eventually, if you get them on the couch and you get them to start talking about this stuff enough, eventually this unconscious, envy of, female creative capacity will come out. Okay. All right, here's a great picture here, and I'll let you just contemplate this. If you want to put this all in a diagram, what I've just talked about, here's a good diagram of this stuff. And this idea that you can have this sort of negative Oedipal complex, this is where the old view of homosexuality came about, where the man would fall in love with the father, the boy would fall in love with the father and be jealous of the mother for getting his attention. You can flip this around. Maybe, I don't know. Again, nowadays in a modern thing, we would not, because we don't view homosexuality as pathological, okay? Just in and of itself. Okay? That's not to say that some homosexual behavior is obviously some homosexual behavior can be related to pathology, just like some heterosexual behavior can be related to pathology. But it doesn't mean being attracted to a member of your own gender is in and of itself pathological. Okay? It's a really important distinction to make. And I think psychologists, psychoanalysts should be thinking about this a little more, because sometimes there's an unconscious thing in the profession where some old school analysts still look at homosexuality as a pathology, as opposed to saying some homosexual behavior stems from a pathological place. Okay? But heterosexual behavior also can stem from a pathological place. We don't say that all heterosexual people are pathological. So we got to make that distinction. Okay? Very important distinction, I think. So you can look at this one. And that's sort of a kind of a weird diagram. The only one I can find. Okay. So, as you might expect, all of this stuff has to do with the development of the personality. Right? Remember personality theory class? This was a psychotherapy class. We could talk about this stuff for days and weeks and weeks and weeks, but this is personality theory class. So all these things we just talked about affect the person's personality. Okay? Psychosexual stages, lingering effects revealed in adult traits and disorders. Libido, frustrated or overindulged at a certain stage, becomes fixated. Fixation creates excessive need characteristics of an earlier stage. Again, these all sort of color the personality of the person. Structure of the personality contains 3 large elements: id, ego, and superego. Id is genetic inheritance, reflexes, instincts, and drives that motivate us. Operate according to this pleasure principle that we're trying to seek pleasure, but I would also say part of that is aggression. The ego develops in order to realistically meet the wishes of the ego, follows the reality principle using secondary processes. If you all drove to school today, you came to a stop sign, did you think, oh, there's a stop sign, I now must lift the muscle in my leg and I need to put it on the brake and I need to press, right? You didn't do that, you just stopped the car. You didn't think about it. Part of the ego is unconscious, part is conscious. Okay? The ego is the thing that helps you negotiate reality. And the superego consists of the conscience, which is your internalized values of what's good and bad, and the ego ideal, which is what your ideal, your projection of what your ideal self could be. What the ideal is that you want that you could be, the standards. These include moral standards, values, these kind of things. Okay? So these are the 3 main areas of the personality or structures. And here's a diagram. As you can see, part of the ego is unconscious, a lot of the superego is unconscious, a little is conscious, and most of the id is unconscious. And again, id, eros, and thanatos coming through the id.